The arrival of the Spanish in the New World did not unfold as a single moment, but as a chain of encounters uneven, uncertain, and often devastating. When the first conquistadors stepped onto Caribbean shores in the late 15th century, they carried with them a world shaped by rigid hierarchies, religious certainty, and the expanding ambitions of the crown. Their mission, whether spoken plainly or cloaked in prayers, was conquest. They believed themselves chosen to civilize, convert, and rule. Yet beneath these grand justifications were thousands of smaller stories, quiet, unrecorded, and lived by the people who faced them. Among these stories were those of Indigenous women, whose lives became entangled with the newcomers in ways both visible and hidden. Their experiences formed the unspoken backbone of colonial survival, guiding, translating, resisting, enduring. Some found themselves drawn into fragile alliances. Others were forced into labor, negotiation, or coerced ties that reshaped entire communities. What unfolded in these years was not just a clash of empires, but an intimate, human confrontation, one that revealed the deepest fractures of conquest. This narrative follows these encounters, chapter by chapter, through the eyes of those who witnessed the rising tide of Spanish power and lived within its shadow. The coastline of Bohio, the land later called Hispaniola, curved like a crescent under the early light of December 1492. For generations, the Taino communities living near the Bay of Marién had watched this horizon without fear, knowing the sea's moods as intimately as their own. Storms came and went, trade winds shifted, and the world remained steady. So when strange, towering shapes appeared against the sunrise, the villagers felt an unfamiliar tremor of unease. 3 great wooden ships, later known as the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria, approached with an intent no one could yet name. Word spread through the settlement of Taino village, where families paused their morning routines to stare at the horizon. Fishermen pulled their canoes ashore, whispering among themselves. Children ran barefoot through the sand, calling out to elders. Among them was Annika, a young woman known for her careful observations. She stood beside her mother, Yara, her gaze fixed on the unnatural silhouettes. The ships were unlike anything the Taino had carved or imagined: tall, angular, with sails catching the wind like pale wings. The elders gathered near the beach. Cacique Guarionex, wrapped in woven cotton marked with his rank, listened as advisors debated fiercely. Some believed the ships carried Zimas, spirits from distant waters. Others argued they must be people, perhaps traders or wanderers who had lost their way. But uncertainty lingered. No one had ever seen wooden structures so large or men traveling in such numbers. As the Spaniards lowered boats and began to row toward shore, their presence became unmistakably human, yet still foreign. Their armor glinted sharply in the sunlight. Their skin was pale, their garments stiff, their beards untrimmed from months at sea. Among them stood Cristobal Colon, known later as Christopher Columbus, flanked by men like Rodrigo de Triana and Diego de Arana, all watching the shore with a mixture of curiosity and calculated ambition. Annika watched closely as the first encounter took shape. The Taino approached with offerings of cassava bread, guava fruit, and gourds of cool water. Hospitality was the way of Bohio, and Guarionex stepped forward with open hands. Columbus responded with gifts of glass beads, red caps, and metal trinkets, speaking words no one understood. Yet even without language, intentions flickered beneath the gestures. The stranger's eyes lingered on the land, its dense forests, clear rivers, and cultivated fields. But their attention also drifted toward the people, especially the women who stepped forward to deliver food. Their stares were heavy and assessing. Anaka felt the weight of these glances and stepped slightly behind her mother. Yara whispered, "These men carry hunger behind their eyes." As the Spaniards moved inland, guided by a few curious villagers, their interest sharpened at the sight of small gold ornaments worn by Taino leaders. Simple pendants and hammered flakes caught the sun. For the Taino, gold keona was spiritual, symbolic, used in ceremonies, not wealth. But Columbus's expression changed when he saw it. He asked, through signs and insistent gestures, where it came from. He repeated the word oro, pointing inland toward the mountains of Cibao. That evening, after the Spaniards returned to their anchored ships, the Taino gathered around a fire. Guarayonics spoke of caution. Others argued the newcomers might bring knowledge or alliance. But Behichio, an influential leader visiting from a nearby chiefdom, warned that the Spaniards' weapons, crossbows, steel blades, and muskets, suggested men accustomed to war. He pointed to the 3 ships and said nobody builds such vessels to seek peace alone. Annika sat quietly, listening as flames flickered across worried faces. She sensed something shifting beyond the edge of understanding. The strangers respected no boundaries, no unspoken rules of kinship or exchange. Their smiles felt practiced. Their curiosity felt invasive. She sensed the beginning of a story that would unfold far beyond this shoreline. When dawn returned, the ships still hovered offshore like great wooden spirits. But now the Taino understood. The newcomers had not arrived merely to visit. They intended to remain. The first shoreline of Bohio, once ordinary and familiar, now marked the opening chapter of a future neither Annika nor her people could yet imagine, a world bending slowly toward conquest. The Spaniards returned to shore on the morning of the 27th of December 1492, this time with greater confidence and a clearer sense of purpose. The wreck of the Santa Maria the night before had shifted the balance of power on the island. Columbus claimed the grounding as misfortune, but to the Taino watching from the beach, it appeared as a sign one the elders debated late into the night. Now stranded with fewer ships, the Spaniards needed shelter, supplies, and the goodwill of the local people more than ever. And that need pressed them closer to the communities along the coast. Annika watched from the palm groves as the boats approached. The men rowed with intensity, restless from long days at sea. Columbus came ashore carrying gifts he considered symbols of alliance: mirrors, knives, brass bells. Behind him followed Pedro Gutierrez and Hernando de Escalante, their gazes scanning the settlement with a mixture of fascination and calculation. They carried crossbows slung casually at their sides, but the message was unmistakable: friendship offered, authority asserted. Cacique Guacanagari, whose territory encompassed the nearby beaches of Nitaino village, stepped forward to greet them. He had been one of the first to assist in recovering timber from the Santa Maria wreck, offering food and fresh water to the Spaniards. His gestures were sincere. He believed in maintaining peace. But even he could not ignore the strange glimmer in their eyes whenever they saw gold or approached the women. The exchange of gifts began with ceremony. The Taino offered cotton cloth, carved stools, and woven baskets filled with yucca bread. The Spaniards, in turn, presented metal tools, objects the Taino regarded with awe for their durability. Yet the moment that unsettled Annika most came when Gutierrez stepped toward a group of young women. He extended a string of glass beads to Arimi, a girl scarcely older than Annika herself. His smile was wide, confident, and uninviting. Arimi hesitated, but curiosity led her to accept the beads. The gesture seemed harmless to the Taino. Gifts symbolized goodwill, partnership, even temporary alliance. But for the Spaniards, such exchanges carried heavier implications. In their world, gifts could bind obligations, create expectations, or imply possession. Columbus watched the interaction with approval. He noted in his journal later that day that the Taino would make good servants, and that their openness, especially the openness of the women, was a sign of divine favor. Annika sensed the shift immediately, even if she could not yet name it. As the day unfolded, the Spaniards moved freely through the village, examining tools, houses, and ceremonial objects. They spoke among themselves, pointing to structures and discussing where a fort might stand. Annika overheard Columbus instruct Diego de Arana, his appointed commander, to begin planning a settlement. The Spaniards called it La Navidad, a place they believed would anchor their authority on the island. To the Taino, it was simply another village, something that might rise or fall with time. But beneath the surface of these exchanges, subtle tensions emerged. Arimi's mother, Maybe, grew uneasy as she watched Spaniards follow her daughter with lingering curiosity. She pulled Arimi aside, whispering warnings about accepting too many gifts. Annika, listening nearby, felt her own fears deepen. the Spaniards' smiles did not reach their eyes. Their gestures of generosity masked an expectation none of the Taino yet understood. That night, Guacanagari hosted a feast to honor the newcomers. Drums echoed across the clearing as men and women danced in the arriito, a ritual meant to convey welcome and solidarity. The Spaniards watched, captivated. Some attempted to dance, stumbling awkwardly but laughing. Others hung back, whispering with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. When the dancers paused to catch their breath, several Spaniards approached the women directly, offering beads and metal trinkets in exchange for attention. A few women laughed nervously, unsure how to refuse without causing offense. Annika noticed Rodrigo Sanchez, one of Columbus's appointed inspectors, watching the scene with analytical precision. His gaze drifted over the women, as though assessing livestock. He spoke quietly to Columbus, who nodded without looking away from the dancers. Their silence carried an unsettling weight. Later that evening, Columbus made a proclamation to his men, a decision Annika did not hear, but would soon feel. He declared that the Taino were a gentle and timid people who could be easily guided toward the crown's interests. He noted that the women were pleasing in appearance and that alliances could be encouraged. In his mind, the blending of cultures was not partnership but opportunity. By the time the feast ended and the Spaniards returned to their temporary camp near the wreck, the Taino still believed they were engaged in diplomacy. Gifts had been exchanged, songs shared, and new faces welcomed. But Annika felt the change. The Spaniards' interest in the land was clear. Their interest in the women was something deeper, more intrusive, and far more dangerous. She walked home beneath the moon, hearing Aremi laughing with her friends and the distant murmur of Spanish voices. Yet the unease in her chest would not settle. Something had begun this night, something that would reach into every household, every village, every life. The gifts given today were not symbols of friendship. They were the first links in a chain yet to be understood. In the first weeks of January 1493, the settlement the Spaniards called La Navidad began to rise from the quiet coastline of Bohio. Built from the timber of the wrecked Santa Maria, its walls stood rough and uneven, yet to the Spaniards it represented permanence, a foothold in a world they saw as ripe for possession. To the Taino, however, its presence felt strange, a structure unlike any they created, casting sharp angles across a landscape shaped by generations of soft, curved dwellings. Annika walked with a group of young women carrying baskets of cassava bread toward the new settlement. Guacanagari encouraged continued diplomacy, insisting that kindness would keep the strangers cooperative. Yet even he could not dismiss the tension that simmered beneath each interaction. The Spaniards' smiles remained practiced, polite, but their presence pressed into the rhythms of village life in ways no one could ignore. Inside La Navidad, Diego de Arana, now commander of the garrison, stood among the men assigned to stay behind once Columbus returned to Spain. He surveyed the fort with pride, speaking of future towns, churches, and holdings. To Annika, watching from a distance, the sound of hammers and shouted orders felt unsettling, too loud, too invasive. It was as if the land itself recoiled each time a post was driven into the soil. The Taino women approached the fort cautiously. The Spaniards greeted them with enthusiasm that bordered on urgency. Pedro Gutierrez called out, waving for the women to bring their baskets closer. Gutierrez's grin stretched wide, but his eyes flickered with something sharper, an interest that was no longer curiosity, but entitlement. Annika watched him offer small objects, knives, beads, buttons to several women in exchange for food. To him, a trinket was meaningless, but to the Taino, objects of metal were rare tools and gifts of value. The imbalance was immediate. Each exchange deepened a quiet dependency the Spaniards encouraged deliberately. That afternoon, Aremi arrived carrying a bowl of roasted fish. She had continued wearing the blue beads Gutierrez had given her. The Spaniard's expression changed when he saw them, an unspoken claim, a silent satisfaction. He stepped closer. Speaking in soft tones Aremi did not understand. She smiled politely, but the confusion in her eyes was unmistakable. Annika moved toward her friend quickly, placing a gentle hand on her arm. She murmured, "Do not walk alone near them." Aremi laughed lightly, brushing off the warning. "They are only strange men from across the sea. They do not mean harm." But Anaka's stomach tightened. She had seen the way Gutierrez and others watched the women, with glances that slid across the body rather than the face, glances rooted not in respect but in ownership. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Guacanagari arrived with several of his advisors. He exchanged formal greetings with the Spaniards, who insisted he join them inside the fort. Columbus, preparing to depart soon, spoke earnestly about leaving a trusted garrison behind. He praised Guacanagari for his support. The cacique listened with calm expression, yet beneath his composed exterior lay growing doubt. He had begun to hear whispers from other villages, stories of Spaniards demanding more food than could be spared, taking objects from homes, and speaking too boldly about Taino customs. When the meeting ended, Columbus presented Guacanagari with a red wool cloak and a polished metal basin. The gifts impressed the crowd, sparkling beneath the torchlight. Yet Anaka sensed something shift in her leader's posture. Gifts from the Taino were offerings of unity. Gifts from the Spaniards were symbols of hierarchy. One joined communities, the other established dominance. As the Taino prepared to return home, a disturbance erupted near the unfinished palisade. Two Spaniards were arguing with a young Taino man named Nobeo, accusing him of withholding information about gold. Their voices rose, sharp and aggressive. Nobeo tried to explain, gesturing that he did not know where more Cayona could be found. The Spaniards, misunderstanding or choosing not to understand, pushed him backward. Anaka stepped forward instinctively, but Yara pulled her aside. "Not yet," her mother warned. "We do not know their limits." Guacanagari intervened quickly, calming the Spaniards and assuring them that if gold existed in greater quantity, he would reveal it. His tone remained diplomatic, but his eyes no longer held certainty. The Spaniards accepted his reassurance with thin smiles. That night, around village fires, tension rippled through the Taino communities. The elders spoke of caution, but their voices held more urgency now. Behichio warned that the Spaniards' hunger for gold would not end with ornaments or trinkets. "They look at our land and see what they desire," he said. "They look at our women and imagine they may take what they wish." His words cast a heavy silence across the gathering. Anaka lay awake long after the fires dimmed. She saw the fort rising in her thoughts, its shadow stretching across the shoreline. She saw Aremi's laughter as she accepted foreign beads, unaware of the danger hidden behind the gesture. She saw the Spaniards' smiles too quick, too practiced, and the unspoken intentions beneath them. The shadows behind those smiles were growing, and the people of Bohio, still hopeful but increasingly wary, stood at the edge of a future they could neither halt nor fully see. The weeks following the Spaniards' arrival unfolded with a rhythm that felt uneven, as though the island itself struggled to adjust to their presence. The construction at La Navidad continued, echoing across the coastline each morning. The Taino offered food, tools, and labor as gestures of peace, believing cooperation might preserve stability. Yet beneath each interaction lay a quiet uncertainty, an awareness that the newcomers interpreted generosity through a different lens. The Spaniards often spoke among themselves in low, hurried tones. They gestured toward the mountains, toward rivers that shimmered with mineral flecks, and toward forests dense with resources they believed had been waiting for them. Their world was built upon the idea of claiming land, opportunity, and people, and this belief seeped into every exchange, even the smallest ones. The women in the village began to notice subtle changes. The Spaniards lingered longer when they visited homes to request food or assistance. Their eyes held a kind of expectation, a familiarity with dominance that the Taino found both confusing and unsettling. A simple greeting became a moment measured, weighed, and sometimes avoided. Children sensed the tension too. They watched from behind palm trunks as armored men walked through the clearing, jingling with metal and speaking loudly. Their weapons fascinated the young, but the elders warned them not to approach too closely. The Spaniards were unpredictable, and unpredictability carried danger. Conversations among the Taino grew more cautious. The leaders met often near the central meeting ground, speaking of harmony but preparing for disruption. Rumors came from distant villages, stories of demands for more food, of misunderstandings turning into confrontation, of women pressured into unwanted company under the guise of hospitality. Though the Taino sought peace, they could not ignore the growing unease that moved like a shadow across the island. The Spaniards, for their part, interpreted Taino openness as permission. They believed kindness indicated submission, and submission granted authority. When they offered gifts, metal tools, small ornaments, the Taino accepted them with customary politeness. But to the Spaniards, these exchanges signaled obligation. A bead could become a tether. A knife could become leverage. They wielded generosity as a quiet strategy, a way to shape relationships in their favor. One afternoon, a group of Spaniards visited the village carrying baskets of unfamiliar goods. They placed them before the women, insisting on laughter and gestures of goodwill. Yet their presence felt heavy, filled with unspoken claims. They spoke in tones that suggested expectation rather than offering, and the women felt the weight of promises they had not made. The Taino men noticed the shift as well. Their own interactions with the Spaniards grew strained. When they offered assistance, the newcomers questioned instead of listened, always searching for signs of hidden wealth. Conversations became a series of misunderstandings, each one revealing how differently the two cultures viewed the world. The building of La Navidad continued, but its walls seemed to divide more than protect. Taino visitors walked its perimeter with caution, sensing a boundary forming a line that, once crossed, could not easily be undone. The Spaniards inside the fort moved with increasing confidence, as though their presence granted them ownership over the land itself. As evening fell, the villagers gathered in quiet circles. The elders spoke again of the need for watchfulness. The newcomers did not understand Taino customs, nor did they seek to learn. Their promises felt uncertain, shaped by ambition rather than respect. The people of Bohio had welcomed them out of generosity, but generosity alone could not bridge the growing rift. Night settled softly across the coastline, but the air carried a sense of change, steady, creeping, unmistakable. The Spaniards would remain. Their expectations would deepen. And the Taino, though still committed to peace, began to brace themselves for disquiet yet to come. The early mornings along the shoreline had once followed a reliable pattern. The hum of insects drifted across the fields, birds called to one another from the treetops, and waves rolled steadily against the sand, carrying the familiar scent of salt and mangrove. Life moved with a rhythm the Taino understood deeply. But as the Spaniards settled into the coast, the air changed. The gentle sounds of the island now mingled with the clang of metal tools, sharp commands in a foreign tongue, and the constant movement of men who behaved as though every space already belonged to them. In the first days after their arrival, the Taino had viewed the newcomers with curiosity. But now, as messages passed between villages, curiosity shifted toward unease. Fishermen returning from distant inlets spoke of Spaniards who insisted on boarding their canoes, examining nets, baskets, and even personal ornaments as though everything required their approval. Families traveling between settlements described encounters in which the newcomers pressed them for information about gold. They gestured impatiently toward mountains and rivers, repeating the same questions despite never understanding the answers. Stories that were once simple observations now carried an underlying tension, and those who listened felt a slow tightening in their chests. The women in the coastal villages sensed this change most acutely. At first, they continued their routines, gathering cassava flour, tending gardens, weaving nets, and preparing food for communal gatherings. Yet each time the Spaniards visited, their presence brought a shift that lingered even after they left. When women approached the shoreline with baskets, the men watched with a familiarity that did not belong to strangers. Their gazes lingered too long, and their gestures carried meanings the Taino could not fully interpret but instinctively distrusted. The Spaniards offered beads, buttons, and small metal objects, as though such items entitled them to deeper access. What the Taino viewed as a polite exchange, the newcomers treated as the beginning of a claim. Conversations within the villages grew quieter and heavier. Elders gathered beneath broad ceiba trees, discussing how best to maintain peace without allowing the newcomers to assume authority. They spoke of offering food only when necessary, and of gently limiting interactions so the Spaniards would understand that the Taino lived by balance, not endless accommodation. Yet they also knew their customs were unfamiliar to these men, and that unfamiliarity could turn quickly into disregard. Many feared that the Spaniards interpreted restraint not as self-governance but as submission. Food became a point of growing strain. The Taino had always shared freely with visiting communities, and in times of abundance, this generosity had strengthened alliances. But the Spaniards consumed without consideration for the effort required to produce what they were given. They returned again and again, expecting more fish, more fruit, more cassava bread, and reacting with confusion when families explained that they needed time to replenish their supplies. The Taino noticed how the newcomers' hands reached quickly and without hesitation, as though no exchange required permission. The changes extended beyond material demands. Whispered concerns spread about the ways Spaniards approached young women on forest paths or along the beach. Some women altered their routines, choosing to gather herbs early in the morning, before the foreigners stirred, or waiting until twilight, when the newcomers returned to their camp. Even these adjustments brought little comfort, for their movements were increasingly shaped by avoidance rather than freedom. Mothers walked in groups when traveling to nearby villages, and older sisters insisted on accompanying younger ones to the riverbanks. Annika listened closely to these stories, noting how each one aligned with her own observations. What had seemed harmless curiosity now felt more like encroachment. She remembered the way certain Spaniards stood too close, the way their expressions shifted when they believed no one was watching, and the way they spoke to one another in tones that revealed confidence, not caution. The Taino had not yet named these shifts, but they felt them deeply. Their hospitality had created a doorway, and the Spaniards walked through it without acknowledging the customs held sacred by those who lived there. Even the landscape seemed unsettled. The thud of construction from the settlement echoed through the trees, a steady rhythm that replaced the quieter harmony of daily life. The fort rose quickly, its rigid architecture a constant reminder that the newcomers intended to stay. As its walls gained height, many of the Taino felt as though the land itself was being reshaped before their eyes, molded by hands that neither understood nor respected its spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea and the horizon glowed with fading color, the villagers gathered to discuss the latest reports. They spoke slowly, weighing each word, trying to understand the intent behind the Spaniards' actions. Though they remained committed to peace, the conversations revealed a growing awareness that peace required acknowledgement from both sides. The Spaniards showed no such understanding. Their expectations expanded day by day, and their presence pressed into Taino life in ways that left little room to breathe. Annika walked home with the fading light behind her, reflecting on the stories whispered along the coast. What troubled her most was not a specific event, but the steady accumulation of small disruptions. Each one alone might have seemed manageable. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The visitors were no longer temporary guests. They were becoming a force that reshaped every corner of the island. And as the shoreline darkened beneath the quiet sky, she sensed that these whispers carried the first warnings of a deeper approaching shift, one that would test the resilience of her people in ways they had never imagined. As the days lengthened into the early months of the year, the Taino communities near the coast felt their world shifting in ways that were neither sudden nor dramatic, but steady and unavoidable. The presence of the Spaniards had woven itself into daily routines, often without invitation. Paths once used freely now carried a quiet uncertainty. The forests, rivers, and shoreline spaces that had always belonged to the rhythms of the island seemed to narrow as the newcomers moved through them with growing confidence. Women traveling to gather herbs or water began altering their routes. Where they once walked with baskets balanced easily on their hips, they now glanced over their shoulders, aware that a Spaniard might appear unexpectedly along the path. These encounters were rarely confrontational, but the tone of them had changed. The Spaniards' smiles lasted too long, their gestures reached too far, and their approach felt less like curiosity and more like entitlement. The women sensed it in the way their steps quickened, even when the Spaniards spoke softly. The elders noticed this shift as well. At evening gatherings, they discussed the changes with increasing concern. They spoke about the need to accompany one another when traveling, to keep young women close, and to avoid the shoreline whenever Spaniards wandered without purpose. These were precautions the Taino had rarely needed before, for their culture valued openness and cooperation. But openness was not a language the newcomers understood. To them, movement was a form of claim, and access suggested permission. In some villages, encounters grew more strained. A fisherman returning from a nearby inlet quietly shared how a group of Spaniards waved him ashore and inspected his catch as though they held authority over the waters. Another man described how they pressed him for information about distant settlements, gesturing impatiently when he could not explain their social ties. The Spaniards reacted with frustration that seemed disproportionate, revealing how essential control was to their worldview. Food remained a constant point of tension. The villagers continued offering what they could, but the demands increased in frequency. Spaniards came ashore requesting more fruits, more fish, more bread, showing little awareness of the labor involved or the needs of the community. Their expectations were shaped by a belief that the land and those who worked it existed to serve their ambitions. The Taino responded with polite explanations, yet their words seemed to dissipate in the air, unheard or misunderstood. Children, once curious and eager to observe the newcomers, began staying closer to home. They no longer ran along the shore without caution. Their parents warned them to avoid wandering too far, and the children obeyed, sensing the strain that shaped the voices of their mothers and fathers. The once carefree rhythms of youth had grown quieter, subdued by a presence they could not fully comprehend. The forest, too, seemed altered. Paths previously used for collecting fruit or gathering palm fronds felt less welcoming. The rustle of branches no longer signaled only animals moving through the brush, but carried the possibility of armored men appearing unexpectedly. Women who once traveled alone now walked in pairs or groups. They avoided lingering in open spaces where they might be approached, choosing instead to move quickly, keeping their conversations low. And yet, even with these precautions, the Taino still sought to maintain peace. Many continued offering gifts, believing that generosity might temper the newcomers' more intrusive behaviors. They shared knowledge of the land in hopes that mutual respect would take root, but the Spaniards interpreted hospitality as confirmation of their authority. When a village welcomed them, they believed it signaled acceptance of their presence, their demands, and their intentions. One evening, as the warm glow of the setting sun stretched across the village, a quiet discussion gathered beneath the larger shade trees. The leaders spoke about the tightening sense that surrounded the community, something not easily named but deeply felt. They observed how the boundaries of their world had shifted, not because they chose new limits, but because the newcomers failed to recognize the ones already in place. They talked of patience and strategy, of the importance of moving carefully until the Spaniards could be understood more clearly. Annika listened, watching the expressions of those around her. She saw concern etched into the faces of people who rarely outwardly displayed fear. She heard the hesitation in their voices as they considered possible futures. What struck her most was how the tension was not born from a single moment, but from countless small encounters, each one shaping the next, tightening the paths they once walked freely. That night, as she lay awake beneath the woven roof of her home, she thought of the forest trail she had traveled since childhood. She remembered the feeling of open space, of belonging to every corner of the land without question. Now, even her steps felt uncertain, measured, small. The paths had not physically narrowed, yet they seemed to press inward, shaped by a presence that moved through them without understanding or restraint. The Spaniards had not spoken of conquest, nor had they declared their intentions plainly, but action spoke with greater clarity than words. And as the island slept beneath the quiet sky, the people of the coast understood a growing truth. The world they had known was being reshaped, not by force alone, but by the steady pressure of those who believed every space they entered belonged to them. The first clear break in the old balance came without warning, in a moment so ordinary that those who witnessed it struggled later to explain why it marked a turning point. It happened near a small clearing where women gathered cassava roots, a place long treated as communal ground. The morning had been quiet, the sound of digging sticks tapping the soil mixing with soft conversation. Nothing about the scene suggested danger, yet change often arrives through small fractures rather than dramatic force. Two Spaniards appeared at the edge of the clearing. Their steps were slow, not rushed, and they approached without raising their voices. The women looked up, expecting perhaps a request for food or directions. Such encounters had become common. But the tone that morning shifted as soon as the men stepped farther into the clearing than anyone had before. They did not wait to be invited. They did not pause to announce themselves. They walked as though the ground carried no boundaries at all. One of the women straightened, holding a woven basket close to her. She greeted them in the calm manner taught by her elders, offering a respectful nod. The men answered with smiles that did not match the situation. One stepped nearer than necessary, reaching toward her basket to examine the cassava inside. The gesture looked harmless, yet it was not. It crossed a line the women had always assumed was understood. The woman stepped back. Her movement was small but deliberate. The others grew silent. A moment of tension settled across the clearing, light but unmistakable. The Spaniards did not seem to grasp what had changed. They kept speaking, pointing, gesturing, stepping closer instead of stopping. Their intentions were unclear curiosity, entitlement, or something more, but their disregard for the space between themselves and the women carried the weight of something long ignored. Later that day, the women described the encounter to the elders. No one was harmed, they said. No violence took place. Yet every listener understood that harm did not always begin with raised voices or force. It often began with a man walking one step too far into a place he believed he had the right to enter. The elders gathered in the center of the village as the sun lowered behind the hills. What troubled them most was not the act itself, but the pattern emerging. The Spaniards no longer treated the Taino with the early politeness they had shown weeks before. They acted as though proximity itself granted permission. The elders debated whether this change came from misunderstanding or from something else, entirely something rooted in a worldview, where boundaries had meaning only when enforced through power. In the weeks that followed, small incidents continued to accumulate. Women reported being approached while bathing at the river, the Spaniards appearing with questions that seemed too eager, too personal. Others described men following them along forest paths under the pretext of practicing the island language. The tone in these interactions carried an unfamiliar edge. It was not the outright aggression of war, nor the chaos of raids. It was something quieter, threaded through gestures that seemed harmless until repeated, until expected, until normalized. Villages tried to adapt. Groups traveled together more often. Young women were encouraged to stay close to the main settlement during the warmest hours of the day. Evenings became a time of shared caution rather than free gathering. The community tried to hold on to the openness that defined their way of life. But openness required mutual respect, and that was slipping away piece by piece. One afternoon, Anaka noticed a change in the laughter of the children. They no longer chased crabs across the sand or raced along the shoreline without pause. They hesitated before playing near the trees, glancing toward the forest path where Spaniards often passed. Their restraint revealed more than any council meeting could. Children sense shifts in their world before adults speak them aloud. They understand when safety alters its shape. Another telling moment occurred during a communal feast. The villagers had invited the Spaniards as a gesture of continued goodwill. Fires burned low as food was shared. Songs carried through the night. And for a brief time it seemed possible that the earlier ease might return. Yet even in this setting, boundaries were crossed. A Spaniard reached for a woman's arm as she served food, guiding her closer as though touching her was his right. The gesture was subtle, masked by celebration, but it darkened the mood around the fire. The music continued, but the rhythm shifted. Some women moved farther from the visitors, finding reasons to stand near their families instead. The elders watched all of this unfold with growing concern. They held quiet discussions about how to proceed, whether to confront the newcomers directly or continue using caution in hopes of preserving peace. No one wished for conflict. The Taino had not invited it, nor did they desire it. Yet conflict does not require invitation. It enters when one side refuses to see the humanity of the other. By the end of the season, the people recognized that the world they lived in was no longer the same one they had known. Boundaries that had once been instinctive were now questioned. Spaces that had felt safe required vigilance. The Spaniards did not declare dominance through force or proclamation. They asserted it through constant, quiet pressure, reshaping the daily rhythms of the island without ever acknowledging they were doing so. For the women especially, the change was unmistakable. They adjusted their movements, altered their routines, and carried themselves with a new awareness, one shaped not by fear itself, but by the need to guard the spaces the Spaniards no longer respected. The break had begun, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a clearing where a man stepped one pace too far, and a woman had no choice but to step back. The change that had begun in quiet moments during the day soon settled into the evenings as well. Villages that once greeted dusk with songs and drumming found themselves adjusting their routines without ever formally deciding to. What had always been a time of gathering slowly became a time of caution, and the people noticed this shift most clearly on the night the drums fell silent. The evening began normally enough. Palm oil lamps flickered along the pathways, their warm glow touching the woven walls of the houses. Smoke drifted from cooking fires, carrying the smell of cassava and roasted fish. Families prepared for the nightly gathering at the central space, a circle of packed earth where stories were told and disputes resolved. This rhythm had guided their ancestors for generations. Yet that night, fewer women arrived early. They lingered at the edges of their homes, speaking softly with their families, glancing toward the trail that led to the Spanish encampment. No one could point to a single reason for their hesitation. It was a feeling that had grown in the days before. The newcomers had begun moving through the village after sunset, not aggressively, but without the consideration that once marked their visits. Their presence during daylight already strained the comfort of the people. At night, it strained something deeper. Annika arrived with her younger cousin, who stayed close to her side. They carried woven baskets filled with fruit to share, a simple offering they had made countless times. But tonight, Annika placed the basket down more slowly, as though unsure of the space around her. She looked toward the far edge of the clearing where the trees cast long shadows. No Spaniard stood there, yet the awareness of their possible arrival lingered over the gathering. The elders took their seats beside the central fire. They spoke about fishing rights along the river and the plans for the next planting season. Their voices carried steady authority, but even they paused now and then, glancing toward the paths. The rhythm of the meeting lacked its usual ease. It was during one of these pauses that the first sign appeared. Footsteps approached from the direction of the encampment, slow, unhurried, unmistakable. A small group of Spaniards stepped into view, lanterns swinging at their sides. They greeted the elders with exaggerated friendliness, as though the village were theirs to walk through freely at any hour. The elders responded with courtesy, but their tone carried a note of restraint. The Spaniards, however, did not seem to notice. They moved closer to the central fire, observing the women as they arranged baskets or shifted seats. Their eyes lingered too long. Their behavior suggested familiarity not earned. The drummers, seated near the boundary of the clearing, waited for the proper signal to begin. Music would normally rise now, marking the transition from discussion to celebration. But the signal never came. Instead, the head drummer placed his hand lightly upon the surface of his instrument and remained still. His silence spread to the others. The fire crackled. The Spaniards stepped closer. One reached toward a clay vessel of fruit as though helping himself at a feast. Another asked a woman where her home stood, his tone too casual for the question. She answered with a short nod and stepped backward, placing herself near the elders. Nothing overt occurred, no force, no raised voices, but the air changed in a way every person felt. The elders exchanged glances. They understood that to begin the music now would signal acceptance, that the Spaniards could walk anywhere, speak to anyone, settle themselves among the gathering without invitation. The Taino valued hospitality, yet hospitality required respect. Without it, the exchange became something else entirely. So the drums did not begin. The Spaniards noticed the quiet. One laughed softly, remarking on the silence of the evening. Another suggested they had arrived at the perfect time to see the village's traditions. Their meaning was unclear, but the tone suggested entitlement. The people waited. The elders refused to move the gathering forward. The Spaniards eventually grew restless and returned to their encampment, lanterns swaying like low stars disappearing into the forest. Only after they were gone did anyone breathe fully. The head drummer lifted his hands again but did not strike the instrument. He looked toward the elders, waiting. They shook their heads. The night had changed shape, they said, and the people needed to reflect rather than celebrate. Families dispersed early. Women walked home in groups, speaking quietly about the men's uninvited arrival. Children asked why the music had not played, and the adults answered with vague explanations about timing and respect. But the children understood more than was said. They had seen the way their mothers stayed close. They had seen the way the elders watched the Spaniards rather than the fire. Annika lay awake long after her family slept. She thought about the gathering place, about the silence that had replaced their songs. The Spaniards did not seem to understand what they had interrupted. Or perhaps they understood and did not think it mattered. The next morning, the villagers gathered again, not for celebration, but for a council. They spoke about how to protect their spaces, how to maintain the safety that had always been assumed rather than enforced. The Taino were not a people drawn to walls or weapons, yet they found themselves discussing both. The drums remained silent for several nights afterward. Their absence became a symbol of caution, of boundaries tightening, of a world shifting under pressure not yet named but deeply felt. It was not the kind of silence that calmed. It was the kind that warned. And though the Spaniards might not have heard that warning, the people did. They understood that something delicate had broken, and soon the consequences of that fracture would reach far beyond a single night. The changes that had settled over the village in recent days did not fade with time. They grew quietly, shaping the habits of the people without altering the outward appearance of their lives. The harvest fields still stretched across the open land, bordered by rows of cassava and young maize. The women still walked the familiar paths each morning, with woven baskets at their hips. Yet what had once been easy movement now carried a measure of caution, especially along the narrow path that wound behind the fields. That path had always been practical rather than ceremonial. It connected the harvest grounds to the riverbank, allowing women to collect water or wash tools without needing to circle around the larger communal areas. Children used it as a shortcut when running errands. Hunters walked it quietly at dawn. Nothing marked it as significant, but everyone understood its place in the daily rhythm. In the weeks after the Spaniards began visiting the village more frequently, the path took on a different meaning. Women began choosing to walk in pairs rather than alone. Older relatives asked the younger ones to return earlier in the day. Even the elders, who often dismissed rumors, spoke with measured concern about travelers who moved through the edges of the forest without announcing themselves. One afternoon, while the sun sat high above the fields, a group of women gathered to prepare woven sacks for the next harvest. Anaka was among them, working with steady hands. They chatted about familiar topics, weather, fishing, the needs of the young and the old. None mentioned the unease that lingered beneath their words, but it was clear in their body language. Every so often, one of them glanced toward the narrow path. They continued their tasks until a distant sound reached them. It was not loud, nor was it unexpected. The Spaniards often sent patrols to map the surrounding land or collect samples of plants they did not recognize. Yet the rhythm of the footsteps felt different that day, unhurried, without the purposeful quality of work. The women exchanged glances as the sound came closer. Anaka rose first. She stepped toward the edge of the field, stopping short of the place where the brush grew thick. She could see the outlines of several figures approaching. They did not carry tools or surveying equipment. One held a water skin, swinging it carelessly. Another gestured toward the fields as though commenting on them. Their conversation was casual, but the direction of their movement was deliberate. The women continued their tasks, though their movement slowed. They were visible. They understood, that these men had chosen to walk the lesser-used path, knowing that those who traveled it were often unaccompanied. The thought that the men understood this pattern made the unease sharper. When the Spaniards reached the open stretch behind the fields, they halted. One of them greeted the women with an overly familiar tone. Another stepped closer than was appropriate. They tried to engage Annika and the others with questions about the fields and the woven sacks. Their words sounded harmless, but the manner of their approach said otherwise. Their confidence suggested they believed the path behind the fields belonged to them now. The women answered with brief, polite phrases. They kept their bodies angled toward one another, creating a quiet wall of presence. The Spaniards seemed amused by this. They lingered longer than necessary. Their movements felt probing, as though they were testing unseen boundaries. Eventually, the men continued down the path, disappearing toward the river. The women did not return to their tasks immediately. Annika watched until the last shadow vanished between the trees. Only then did she sit again. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. That evening, the elders called another meeting. They asked the women to describe what they had witnessed, and the discussion grew into a larger conversation about safety along the paths. These talks had become common in recent weeks, but now they took on a more urgent tone. Some argued that the villagers should avoid the path altogether, at least until they understood the intentions of the newcomers more clearly. Others insisted that abandoning it would send a message of surrender. The path, they said, existed because the village created it. It was theirs by right of use and tradition. In the end, the elders agreed that no woman should walk it alone. Younger men offered to escort their relatives when possible. But nothing could erase the reality that the imbalance between the villagers and the Spaniards was growing with each passing day. The path remained open, yet it carried a quiet warning now. Every rustle in the brush caused women to glance over their shoulders. Every unfamiliar voice made them pause. The Spaniards did not need to take anything by force to alter the rhythm of the community. Their presence alone shifted the world around them. Annika walked the path again a few days later, accompanied by her cousin. They moved quickly, baskets in hand, speaking little. Each of them looked to the corners where forest met field. Nothing stirred, yet both felt the tension that had woven itself into the land. The path had once been a simple route connecting necessary spaces. Now it had become a line of caution, a reminder that the changes unfolding in the village did not occur only in moments of open conflict. Some changes were quiet, slow, and difficult to name, yet they were just as powerful. The villagers sensed that more changes were coming. The silence along the path behind the harvest fields was only the beginning, a sign that the threads of daily life were being pulled from directions they had not chosen. What remained uncertain was how far those threads would stretch before they snapped. The riverbank had always offered a place of balance for the village. It carried water for drinking, shaped the rhythm of planting seasons, and gave a sense of calm through the sound of its steady movement. Women gathered there each morning to wash tools, clean baskets, or bathe younger children. The air along the water was usually filled with ordinary noises, the scrape of stone against wood, quiet laughter, and the splash of river currents brushing against the shore. On the morning that marked a turning point for many of the women, the riverbank felt unusually still. The sun had risen, casting its soft light across the water, but the usual ease was replaced by a subtle tension. Only a few women had come that day, their tasks completed in a more subdued manner. Among them was Annika, who walked with two others carrying baskets that needed rinsing. They reached the water's edge and settled into their routine. Their hands moved in familiar motions, yet they remained alert to the surrounding sounds. The memory of the recent encounter near the fields was still fresh, and the women had begun forming quiet habits, in response standing closer together, choosing times of day when more people might be present, avoiding secluded corners of the river when they could. As they worked, a faint movement on the far side of the clearing caught Annika's attention. She turned her head slightly, pretending to focus on adjusting her basket. Through the tall grass, she could see the outline of several men approaching. Their clothing, their posture, and the pattern of their movement revealed who they were, even before their faces became clear. The Spaniards had chosen this place today. The women exchanged quick glances. None spoke. but each understood what the others were thinking. The riverbank, once a place of routine, had now become a space where they could no longer assume privacy. They continued their tasks without showing fear, though their motions grew tense. The men did not come directly to the water. Instead, they paused near a grouping of rocks, observing the women quietly. Their presence alone altered the air. The women kept their eyes lowered, not wanting to invite interaction, yet not wishing to appear afraid. They tried to maintain the rhythm they had always known. One of the Spaniards eventually stepped forward. His tone was light, as if he were simply greeting neighbors, but his approach was deliberate. He asked questions about the river, about how the women used it, about the tools they carried. None of the questions required an answer, yet he waited for one anyway. Annika responded with short phrases that revealed nothing beyond courtesy. The man stepped closer, examining the woven basket she held. His attention lingered in a way that made her uneasy. The other women shifted slightly to stand nearer to her. Their presence formed a quiet barrier, one that did not challenge the men but signaled unity. Another Spaniard spoke from behind the first, commenting on the river's beauty and the land that surrounded it. His words were softened by a smile, but the women recognized the way he surveyed the area. It was not admiration. It was assessment, as though he were evaluating the space for his own use. The men remained longer than needed, standing near the water's edge with an air of casual ownership. When they finally turned to leave, their departure did little to ease the tension. The women watched until the last figure disappeared into the trees. Only then did they allow themselves to breathe deeply. Annika rinsed the final basket with steady hands, though her mind was elsewhere. She could not ignore the changes she had witnessed in recent days, the way familiar spaces were being shaped by a presence they could not control. The riverbank, once a quiet refuge, now carried a shadow that followed even the simplest tasks. The walk back to the village was quiet. The women stayed close, their feet moving in measured steps along the worn path. When they reached the village, they parted without lingering conversation. Each carried her own thoughts, yet all understood that the day had confirmed what they had begun to suspect. No place, not even the river that had served their community for generations, was free from intrusion. That evening, when families gathered near the central space to share food and stories, the women spoke softly with the elders. They described the visit to the riverbank, the behavior of the men, and the growing pressure that seemed to follow them from one place to another. The elders listened with concern. They had hoped the earlier incidents were isolated. Now, they knew they were part of a pattern. They discussed the possibility of assigning companions for routine tasks, not as a rule, but as a safeguard. Some resisted the idea, remembering times when the land felt safe and open. Others accepted it as necessary. The uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on them all. The river flowed as it always had, unchanged in its course, yet the world around it was shifting. A place that had once represented peace had revealed the unsettled truth of the new reality settling over the village. Even the water could not wash away the sense that something deeper was changing. The captain's demand. The village had grown accustomed to the presence of the Spaniards, though not with comfort. Their visits had become part of the rhythm of daily life, unwelcome, unpredictable, and always burdened with tension. But on a warm afternoon, when the tide rested low along the shore, a different kind of visit arrived. One marked not by wandering curiosity, but by intention. A group of Spaniards approached the village with a level of order that set them apart from the usual patrols. At their center walked a man whose attire and posture made his role unmistakable. He carried himself with an air of authority, his movements steady and confident, as though the land beneath his feet already belonged to him. The villagers paused to watch, sensing that this meeting would bring a new shift. The captain surveyed the structures, the people, and the open spaces with a calculating gaze. Children moved closer to their mothers. Elders remained seated, though their eyes followed every step. The man's interest was not in the village itself, but in the people who filled it, and when he stopped before the elders, the atmosphere tightened. Through an interpreter, the captain explained that he sought cooperation for the sake of order. His tone suggested a request, but his stance made it clear that refusal was not expected. He spoke of assistance, of shared benefit, of duties owed to those who had brought new power to the islands. The words were practiced, shaped to sound reasonable, but the villagers could hear the strain beneath them. The demand was not about cooperation, it was about control. He then shifted the conversation toward the women of the village. He spoke of tasks that required their presence near the Spanish encampment, carrying supplies, preparing food, tending to workspaces. These tasks, he claimed, were essential to the harmony between their peoples. But the elders recognized this pattern. They had seen how the Spaniards looked at the women, how they lingered near them, how their presence caused quiet distress. The captain emphasized that he expected a group of women to accompany his men the following morning. His tone made it clear that he considered the matter settled. The interpreter repeated his words, though with a lowered voice, as though even he understood the weight of what was being asked. A long silence followed. The elders exchanged measured glances, weighing the risks of defiance against the dangers of compliance. The villagers stood nearby, tense and restless, aware that this moment marked a new threshold. Finally, one elder stepped forward, speaking with careful restraint. He explained that the women already held responsibilities. The captain listened, his expression fixed. When the elder finished, he responded with a short, dismissive remark. He insisted that their tasks were secondary, compared to the needs of the Spanish crown. He repeated his expectation. A group of women would report to the encampment at dawn. The tension in the air deepened. A few villagers shifted uncomfortably. Mothers drew their daughters closer. The captain's eyes moved over the gathered people, studying their reactions, measuring their hesitation. When the captain departed with his men, the village remained silent, as though the air itself had been pressed into stillness. As soon as the Spaniards disappeared down the path, the elders gathered the community into the central clearing. Their faces carried concern rarely shown so openly. They discussed the demand, each voice reflecting fear, anger, or disbelief. Some believed compliance might prevent harsher consequences. Others argued that sending women to the encampment invited dangers they could not risk. The village had never faced such direct pressure, and the uncertainty of how far the Spaniards were willing to go added a heavy weight to every decision. Annika listened as her mother spoke quietly about the changes they had seen over the past weeks, the visits, the stares, the encroachments. Nothing about the captain's request felt rooted in honest need. It felt like another step towards something deeper, something more controlling, something that threatened their safety in ways they could not ignore. The discussion lasted until the sun dropped lower in the sky. No clear answer emerged. Every choice held danger. The villagers dispersed slowly, each returning to their home, carrying the unspoken knowledge that dawn would not bring the ordinary beginning of a new day. It would bring a test that none of them had wished for. That night the village did not sleep easily. Fires burned closer to the doorways. Mothers whispered to daughters, urging caution. Elders watched the paths leading toward the forest. And as the moon rose, its pale light revealed the quiet truth resting across the settlement. The captain's demand was not simply a request. It was a signal that the Spaniards were no longer content with wandering the land. They now sought to shape it, and the people within it, according to their own will. The night after the captain's demand felt unusually long. Even the sounds of the forest seemed muted, as though the land itself was waiting for the sun to rise and reveal what would happen next. Before dawn touched the horizon, 2 scouts who had been observing the Spanish encampment returned to the village. Their arrival brought an immediate gathering of elders and families, all anxious to hear what they had learned. The scouts approached quietly, both carrying the same strained expression. They had left before sunset the previous evening, hoping to watch the Spaniards from a distance and gather any sign of their intentions. Now, as they stood before the elders, their voices carried the urgency that the village had feared. They described the encampment as unusually active. Instead of resting after the day's patrols, the Spaniards had been preparing for something. Fires burned bright, and several groups of soldiers moved in and out of the central area. Supplies were gathered in piles, ropes, crates, bundles of cloth, and men seemed to be checking equipment late into the night. It was not the behavior of a group waiting quietly for the next morning. It was the behavior of those expecting resistance and preparing to overcome it. One scout described how he had seen a small group of Spaniards talking near the edge of the camp. They pointed toward the path that led to the village and gestured in a way that suggested impatience. Their posture and tone made it clear they believed the village would comply with the captain's demand, but they were also prepared for the possibility that it would not. Another scout had taken position on a hillside overlooking the encampment. From there he saw 3 men handling items that worried him deeply. Though he had never seen such objects before, their shapes resembled restraints loops of rope, cords tied into stiff knots, lengths of binding material that glinted in the firelight. The men tested them with practiced movements, pulling them taut before setting them aside. The implication was unmistakable. When the scouts finished speaking, the crowd reacted with a quiet flush of fear. The elders exchanged grave looks. The village had hoped that the Spaniards' demand was simply pressure, not a threat. But now, the signs pointed otherwise. The encampment's preparation revealed the true nature of the captain's plan. He had not made a request. He had issued an order, and he expected it to be obeyed. The elders gathered closer, lowering their voices as they spoke. They debated whether it was safest to send a select group of women to satisfy the Spaniards, even if unwillingly, or whether to refuse entirely and risk provoking a confrontation. Neither path felt safe. Compliance might invite harsher demands in the future. Refusal might bring immediate force. Some of the villagers suggested moving the women to a nearby settlement for protection. Others argued that separating families would spread fear and weaken their unity. Annika listened to every voice, weighing the arguments carefully. She felt the growing truth that had been shadowing their village for weeks. The Spaniards were not visitors looking for friendship. They were men who believed their will should guide everything around them. As the discussion continued, one elder raised a suggestion that many had not considered sending envoys to neighboring villages who had also encountered the Spaniards. Perhaps other communities had discovered ways to navigate the newcomers' demands. Perhaps they had faced similar situations and could offer guidance. The idea carried hope, though small. By the time the sun rose above the hills, the village had not reached a resolution. The scouts' warning had unsettled every option they had considered. The people dispersed into smaller groups, preparing silently for whatever the day would bring. Mothers stayed close to their daughters. Men assembled near the central path, not as an act of defiance, but as a precaution. Annika walked to the edge of the clearing, watching the faint line of the horizon. She could feel the shift that had taken hold of their world, subtle at first, but now unavoidable. Where once there had been calm, now there was watchfulness. Where once there had been certainty, now there was doubt. The scouts' warning had changed everything. It revealed not only the Spaniards' impatience, but their intention to act on it. The village could no longer assume they had time to decide. They now faced a choice not of preference, but of survival. And as the sunlight spread across the land, touching the river, the forest, and the paths leading to the encampment, the villagers understood that the day ahead would test the limits of their unity and the strength of their resolve. When the sun fully rose, its light cast a soft glow across the village, but no warmth reached the people gathered in its center. The elders had remained awake through most of the night, moving between small groups and listening to every concern. Now, with the morning upon them, they faced the reality that the Spaniards could arrive at any moment to collect the women the captain had demanded. Families gathered close. Mothers kept their daughters within arm's reach. Young men stood watch at the edges of the village. Not with weapons, there were few they could wield in comparison to the Spaniards' steel, but with the hope that their presence alone would discourage intrusion. Everyone knew hope was fragile, yet it was all they could hold. Annika stood among the women, her heart steady but uneasy. No one spoke openly about who might be chosen if the village complied. It felt impossible to decide such a thing, and even the elders avoided suggesting names. Every woman had a life, a family, and a role, and none deserved to be singled out. But avoiding the decision did not remove the pressure. The Spaniards would arrive, expecting cooperation. The elders called a final meeting in the central clearing. Their faces showed the strain of responsibility. They began by acknowledging the scouts' warning. The Spaniards were preparing for resistance. This meant the village could not treat the captain's demand as a simple request. One elder argued that sending a group of women volunteers or not would spare the village from immediate harm. He insisted that the Spaniards were too powerful to resist directly, and that refusal might provoke violence. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his own discomfort with the idea, but he believed fear of the alternative justified compliance. Another elder spoke against him with equal intensity. She argued that if they surrendered women now, the Spaniards would return with more demands. Today, they would ask for a few. Tomorrow, they might take without asking. Protecting the women meant protecting the stability of the entire village. Her words carried strength, but the uncertainty of the future made them heavy. Voices rose as the debate unfolded. Some families pleaded for a compromise. Others preferred to flee temporarily, hoping to avoid confrontation. But fleeing would mean abandoning their homes, their crops, and their ancestral grounds, sacrifices not lightly made. The conversation slowed only when Annika stepped forward. Until now, she had listened quietly, absorbing every argument. But seeing her community pulled between fear and self-preservation stirred something within her. She spoke calmly, reminding them that decisions made from fear alone often invited deeper danger. She did not offer a solution, none seemed clear, but she encouraged the elders to consider what choice would protect the village, not just today, but in the days that would follow. Her words did not resolve the conflict, but they softened the tone. The elders returned to discussion, more measured now, though no closer to consensus. Before they could settle on a plan, a sound drifted across the clearing, a rhythmic clatter, the unmistakable noise of metal striking armor. The Spaniards were approaching. Their arrival silenced the village. The captain led the group again, his stride purposeful, his expression fixed. Several soldiers followed behind him, carrying the same quiet authority as the previous day. Today, however, their formation was tighter, their eyes more watchful. They were not here to negotiate. When they reached the center of the clearing, the captain looked at the elders with an expectation that felt like pressure on the air itself. He spoke through the interpreter, repeating his demand with a sharper edge. He wanted the women brought forward now. He insisted that this cooperation was necessary, and that delay showed disrespect. The elders exchanged strained glances. Their hesitation was obvious, and the captain noticed. His expression narrowed. The soldiers behind him shifted slightly, as though preparing for a signal. The tension grew until it became almost unbearable. The village stood motionless, caught between surrender and defiance. There was no clear path, only choices that carried risk. Finally, one elder stepped forward with a suggestion meant not as acceptance, but as a stalling measure. He explained that they needed more time to prepare the women. The captain had requested time to ensure they understood the tasks expected of them. The words were spoken with deliberate calm, hoping to appeal to the Spaniards' sense of order. The captain paused. He studied the elder's face as though searching for hidden meaning. The delay frustrated him, but he did not immediately react with anger. Instead, he insisted the women be ready by the next sunrise, and warned that failure to comply would be seen as resistance. Without waiting for a reply, he signaled his men to withdraw. Their march away from the village carried the heavy sound of metal and boots against earth, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with dread. The villagers remained silent long after the Spaniards disappeared. The reprieve felt fragile, only a single day gained, and the burden of deciding what to do next settled more heavily upon them than before. The elders understood now that their time for debate had ended. By dawn, they would need to choose a path that could alter the fate of the village. And with each passing moment, the weight of that decision pressed harder against every heart. As the sun began to descend behind the tree line, the village fell into a silence that felt different from any previous night. The captain's warning lingered in the air like a thick mist, settling over every household and every conversation that never rose above a whisper. Darkness had always come gently to this land, bringing rest and renewal, but on this night it carried tension instead of calm. Families gathered close in their homes, small fires burned low to avoid drawing attention, and the usual chatter of evening life had vanished completely. Mothers sat with their daughters, brushing their hair with slow, calming strokes. Fathers spoke softly to their sons, teaching them to remain alert without stirring fear. The elders walked through the village, checking on each household, offering quiet reassurance though their own hearts carried worry. The question that had been debated all day remained unresolved. What should the village do when dawn arrived? No one wanted to surrender women to the Spaniards, yet no one wanted to provoke a violent confrontation. The uncertainty made the air feel heavy. As night deepened, several elders gathered with a small group of trusted villagers near the center of the settlement. They formed a circle around a dim fire, voices low and deliberate. They discussed possibilities, searching for a way to protect the women without igniting the anger of the Spaniards. No plan seemed complete enough, yet every moment wasted brought them closer to the captain's deadline. Annika joined them quietly. She had spent the afternoon helping her mother prepare food, but her mind had remained fixed on the conversation earlier that day. She had watched her village struggle between fear and dignity, and she had felt the growing weight of a decision that would shape her people's future. Now, as she listened to the elders, she realized that the solution might not be a single action but a collection of smaller, careful choices. One elder suggested hiding the women in a nearby settlement until the Spaniards gave up searching. Another proposed relocating only the youngest women, believing the Spaniards would be less forceful if they saw the difficulty of identifying individuals. A third elder suggested sending a group of older women, instead those whom the Spaniards might overlook, hoping such a gesture would satisfy the captain without endangering the younger ones. None of the options felt safe. Each carried a different kind of risk. At last, the eldest among them, an old man known for his calm wisdom, spoke with quiet certainty. He said that the village must not surrender any woman at all, but neither should they openly defy the captain. Instead, he proposed a subtle form of resistance. The women would leave the village before dawn, not to flee entirely, but to travel deeper into the forest, to a place known only to their people. They would remain there, safe and out of sight, until the immediate danger passed. Meanwhile, the elders would meet the captain at sunrise and explain that the women were away collecting food from distant groves, a task requiring several days. This explanation would not satisfy him, but it might delay him long enough to prevent the Spaniards from searching the homes. The plan depended on the Spaniards' impatience and the hope that they would not risk navigating unfamiliar forest terrain. It was not a perfect solution, but it offered safety without direct confrontation. After a long silence, the elders agreed. Word spread discreetly across the village. Women were told to prepare small bundles of food and water. They were instructed to leave quietly, one by one, before the moon reached its highest point. Men volunteered to escort them to the forest's edge, though they would not follow beyond it, trusting the women to navigate the familiar paths alone. Annika returned home to tell her mother and sister. The news stirred mixed emotions, fear, relief, uncertainty, but her mother accepted it with steady resolve. They packed lightly, taking only what was necessary for 2 nights. When the time came, the women began slipping into the shadows, moving through the village with silence honed by necessity. No torches were lit. The faint glow of the moon guided them along the paths between the homes. Dogs remained quiet, sensing the seriousness of the moment. At the edge of the forest, a group of men waited. They offered quiet blessings before the women disappeared into the trees. Annika paused for a moment, looking back at the village she loved so deeply. The fires glowed faintly, and the figures of her people stood watchful and still. Then she turned and followed the others into the forest, where thick branches and soft earth swallowed their footsteps. By midnight, the village stood empty of its women, yet full of tension. Men kept watch from hidden points, prepared for any early arrival of the Spaniards. The elders sat together, reviewing the plan again and again, knowing that dawn would bring questions they had no choice but to answer. As the last embers of the night settled, the village held its breath. The path of resistance had been chosen not through force, but through unity, silence, and the refusal to surrender what could not be replaced. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, stretching pale light over the treetops, the rooftops, and the quiet paths of the village. No birdsong greeted the morning. The forest remained still, as if it sensed the tension that lay upon the settlement. The villagers who had stayed behind gathered near the central clearing, their faces drawn with worry but set with determination. The women were already deep within the forest by this hour, moving carefully along hidden trails where no outsider could follow. The elders stood together near the center of the clearing, as they had agreed the night before. Their expressions were steady, though their hearts thudded with uncertainty. They knew the captain would return, and they knew he would arrive expecting compliance. They had prepared their explanation, rehearsed their tone, and agreed that none of them would reveal where the women had gone. Their unity was the only shield they could offer. The sun had barely lifted when the sound of marching footsteps cut through the stillness. Metal clinked against metal. Boots struck the earth in sharp rhythm. The villagers straightened, their shoulders tensing as the Spaniards emerged along the path from the shore. The formation was larger than the previous visit. At least a dozen soldiers followed the captain, their movements rigid and purposeful. The captain stopped abruptly in front of the elders. His gaze swept across the village, noting the absence of women. His jaw tightened. Without waiting for translation, he demanded to know why the women were not prepared as he had ordered. The interpreter relayed his words, though his voice wavered slightly. The elders stepped forward in unison. The eldest among them explained, in a quiet but steady voice, that the women had left at dawn to gather food from distant groves. These groves, he said, required several days of travel. Their departure had been planned long before the captain's request. They would not return until their baskets were full. The captain's expression hardened. He saw through the explanation, though he could not disprove it. Still, the inconvenience irritated him. He viewed the timing as defiance, even if no one openly challenged his authority. His soldiers shifted behind him, waiting for a command. The interpreter repeated the captain's reply. He wanted the women brought back immediately. The elders bowed their heads slightly, maintaining respect. They explained that messengers had already been sent to notify the women, but the journey would take time. The women could not be recalled instantly. The elders emphasized that the villagers valued their responsibilities and would not disrupt them unless absolutely necessary. The captain did not accept the answer. His voice grew sharper. The interpreter struggled to keep pace with his rising frustration. The villagers could feel the tension deepen with each exchange. One of the younger men stepped forward, offering additional reassurance. He explained that the women would return soon, that the village wished only to maintain its traditions, and that no offense was intended. It was an attempt to show cooperation without submission. But the captain was not satisfied. His eyes narrowed as he studied the young man. He stepped closer, accusing the villagers of stalling. He warned that failure to comply would bring consequences. The soldiers behind him shifted their weapons not raised, but adjusted just enough to remind the villagers of their strength. Several men from the village stepped forward instinctively, not to provoke, but to protect. No one spoke, yet the air thickened with the unspoken possibility of violence. For a moment, the captain remained silent, calculating. The forest was dense and difficult to navigate. He knew the women could disappear easily among the trees. Pursuing them blindly would be foolish. Yet letting the village dictate the terms offended him deeply. At last, he issued a warning through the interpreter. He would return soon, and when he did, he expected the women to be present. If they were not, he would take action. What kind of action? He did not specify, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any clear threat. With a sharp gesture, he ordered his men to withdraw. They marched away from the village, leaving behind a trail of tension that clung to the air long after they disappeared from view. The villagers exhaled in unison, though relief was fleeting. The captain had accepted the elders' explanation for now, but only barely. His anger had not diminished. It had only been delayed. The elders gathered once more, their voices low and urgent. They needed time to plan, time to prepare, time to protect their people from what would come next. The forest paths gave the women safety for the moment, but no one knew how long that safety would last. Anaka's mother sat near the edge of the clearing, watching the path where the Spaniards had vanished. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to steady them. The day had only begun, yet she felt the weight of what lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers moved slowly back to their tasks, though none of them truly worked. Their attention remained fixed on the treetops, the shoreline, and the paths leading inward. They understood what the morning had revealed. The Spaniards would not relent. They would return again, and next time, their expectations would carry sharper edges. The village had gained one more day, but at a cost. Their quiet resistance had been noticed, and now the danger around them had grown. The women who had left the village during the night moved deeper into the forest as dawn approached. The path they followed was narrow, winding between tall trunks and dense foliage. They knew these trails well. They had walked them since childhood to gather fruits, herbs, and fibers. Yet on this morning, every step felt heavier. The forest, once a place of comfort, had become their refuge and their hiding place. They walked in single file, guiding one another with careful gestures. The group included mothers, sisters, young women, and elders, whose wisdom kept panic at bay. Annika walked near the front beside her mother, listening to the sounds around them. The rustle of leaves, the snap of distant branches, the soft hum of insects awakening with the light. Each sound reminded her of the safety the forest had offered for generations, but also of the danger that pushed them there now. After several hours of steady walking, the group reached a clearing known only to their community. It was a sheltered space protected by thick clusters of trees whose roots rose like natural barricades. A shallow stream ran nearby, offering fresh water. The elders had chosen this place long ago as a retreat for rituals or emergencies, though it had rarely been used. The women set down their bundles, speaking softly to avoid disrupting the quiet of the forest. Some began gathering sticks for a small fire, while others arranged leaves into bedding. Everyone contributed to building a temporary home, knowing they might remain here longer than expected. Annika helped her younger sister collect water from the stream. The coolness of the flowing water soothed her hands, but her mind stayed alert. She wondered what was happening back in the village. She imagined her father standing with the other men, holding himself calm even as uncertainty circled him. She hoped her presence in the forest eased his worry rather than deepened it. When the settlement was ready, the women gathered beneath a large canopy of branches. One of the older women led them in a quiet tradition, meant to strengthen their spirits, an offering of crushed leaves to the earth, accompanied by a whispered plea for protection. The ritual did not erase their fear, but it steadied their hearts. As the day progressed, the forest around them grew warmer. Some of the younger women wandered through the clearing, exploring the edges but never stepping beyond the elders' instructed limits. The forest felt peaceful, yet they all understood that peace existed only because danger stood outside of it. The Spaniards could not track them here, not easily, but the thought of being hunted made even the softest breeze feel weighted. Later in the afternoon, a small group of women climbed a rise at the edge of the clearing to observe the trail leading back toward the village. From this vantage point, the forest stretched endlessly, its shadows shifting with the light. The trail remained empty. No distant movements suggested the presence of the Spaniards. Yet the watchers remained vigilant, understanding that silence could mislead. Below them, in the clearing, others prepared food from the supplies they had brought. They worked efficiently, ensuring the little they had would last. Annika sat with her mother and sister sharing roasted fruits and roots. Their conversation was quiet, broken by pauses as they listened for any sound out of place. In the early evening, the forest began to cool. The crackle of their small fire echoed lightly through the clearing. Some women braided baskets to pass the time. Others rested. A few spoke of their fears, their words careful yet honest. They wondered how long they would need to stay hidden. They wondered when it might be safe to return. They wondered what the men back home were facing. Annika listened, but her thoughts drifted repeatedly to the captain's arrival that morning. She knew the elders would handle it with as much wisdom as they could offer. But she also knew the Spaniards were becoming more forceful, less patient, more demanding. The village could not avoid confrontation forever. As night settled, the forest around them changed its voice. Crickets chirped in steady rhythm. Branches shifted atop the canopy, stirred by wind. Small animals moved through the underbrush. The women prepared for sleep in scattered groups, though few expected to rest fully. Annika lay beside her sister, watching the shifting patterns of moonlight through the leaves. Her mother sat close, her posture awake and alert, like many others who feared closing their eyes. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the rustling of the forest or the racing of anxious thoughts. Still, the shelter held. The trees rose around them like guardians. The earth beneath them felt solid and familiar. And though danger pressed against the horizon of their world, the forest offered a pocket of safety, small but meaningful. The women understood that staying hidden was only a temporary solution. Eventually, they would need to face what awaited them in the village. But tonight, they had protection, space to breathe, and the strength of their unity. And for now, that was enough to carry them through the darkness. The forest had sheltered the women longer than any of them expected. 2 full days passed beneath its canopy, each shaped by caution, hushed conversations, and the distant hope that the Spaniards' anger might cool with time. But by the evening of the 2nd day, the elders' messengers arrived at the hidden clearing, their faces tight with urgency. The Spaniards had returned to the village again earlier than predicted, more forceful than before. They had searched along the outskirts, questioned the men, and demanded answers. Though they had not entered the forest, their restlessness made it clear that they would not tolerate delay much longer. The elders believed that if the women remained hidden past nightfall, the Spaniards might escalate their actions in ways the village could not easily contain. The message was simple but heavy. The women must return before twilight fully settled. Their presence alone, not surrender, not compliance, might buy the village enough time to face what came next with dignity intact. Annika stood with the group as the decision was explained. No one welcomed the idea of returning, yet no one argued against it. The elders had protected them through caution. Now they asked the women to protect the village through presence. Fear flickered across many faces, but their resolve did not break. They gathered their small bundles and prepared for the walk home. Before leaving, the oldest woman in the group offered a final blessing. She placed her hands upon the roots of the great trees and whispered a prayer for safe passage, for unity, and for strength. The others stood in silence, their breath steady, their hearts braced for what waited beyond the forest. The path back felt different from the path they had taken in fear 2 nights earlier. The forest's protective walls now felt like a boundary they would have to leave behind. As they walked, the late sunlight filtered through the branches in muted gold. The sounds of the forest softened behind them as the village came into reach. When they stepped out of the trees, the men who had been watching the trails rushed toward them with quiet relief. Their expressions showed both gratitude and worry. No one spoke loudly. The air felt too fragile for noise. Families embraced quickly, their moments brief but heartfelt. As they walked toward the center of the village, Annika noticed changes. The usual rhythm of daily work had been disrupted. The men hovered near tools or baskets no one used. Children stayed close to their parents. The elders gathered near the central clearing, waiting, watching the path that led to the Spanish encampment. Word of the women's return spread quietly. Some villagers stepped out of their homes, their faces marked by exhaustion from the past 2 days. Others remained inside, listening through shuttered windows. Annika's mother clasped her father's hand. Relief washed over his features, though it quickly shifted into worry. The elders signaled for the women to gather together near the central clearing. They wanted the Spaniards to see the village united when they arrived, not submissive, but not openly resistant. Strength, the eldest said, often appeared in the spaces between those 2 extremes. The sun lowered, casting long shadows across the settlement. The air cooled. The village waited. And then the sound came again, boots striking earth, the rattling of armor, the steady march that had become so familiar and so feared. The Spaniards emerged through the trees, led by the captain, whose expression darkened at the sight of the assembled villagers. He paused when he saw the women standing safely among their people. His gaze tightened, and though he said nothing at first, the disappointment in his posture revealed more than words could. He had expected obedience. What he found instead was unity, quiet, steady, unyielding. The interpreter stepped forward, ready to deliver whatever demand would come next. But for a long moment, the captain spoke only with his eyes, scanning the villagers' faces as though measuring their resolve. Finally, he addressed the elders. His words were clipped, cold, and tense, He accused them of deception, of disrespect, of obstructing the needs of the crown. Through the interpreter, he demanded an explanation for why the women had been hidden. The eldest elder stepped forward, his back straight. He explained calmly that the women had been fulfilling essential tasks in the forest, and that the village meant no defiance. Their responsibilities, he said, could not be abandoned without preparation. He acknowledged the captain's authority, but did not surrender the dignity of his people. The captain listened with visible irritation. He gestured sharply, and the soldiers behind him shifted, but he did not give the command to advance. Something held him back, perhaps the lateness of the hour, perhaps the unexpected solidarity before him, or perhaps the unspoken awareness that crossing certain lines could rouse consequences even he was not prepared for. After a long, heavy silence, he issued a final warning. He expected full cooperation in the days ahead. Without elaborating, he turned sharply and led his men away. The village stood motionless until the sound of their march faded completely. Only then did they allow themselves to breathe. The twilight deepened, casting cool shadows across the settlement. Families came together. Fires were lit. Food was shared. Relief mixed with fear. But beneath both lay something steadier, a sense of unity that had not existed before. The villagers knew this was not an ending. The Spaniards would return. Their demands would continue. Their presence would shape the land in ways no one could yet predict. But for this night, the village had protected its women. The forest had sheltered them, and their unity had held firm. Annika stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the stars emerge above the trees. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she understood something important. Her people were learning to stand together, not through open conflict, but through quiet, coordinated strength. The twilight dimmed, and the first night after their return began uncertain, fragile, but undeniably their own.